Alright, we got our first game for this episode. We are on episode number 6 of our educational speedrun series. We are playing, or starting first of all at a rating of 918. We're playing against Andaluz D1977, rated 937 in this first game. So after the move knight f3, our opponent began with the move knight to c6. And this is already a move very early in the game. We are playing kind of for our ready approach, I would say. However, when our opponent plays the move knight c6 after our knight f3, they do have the potential idea of playing the move pawn to e5 on move number 2 of the game. And so this is why we're playing the move d4. We're discouraging black from playing the move pawn to e5. And essentially now we're actually playing a d4, d5 type of opening. However, the kind of the advantage for us in white shoes is that black has already committed their knight to the c6 square, which is usually not a great place for it to be in these d4, d5 openings, or these d4, d5 pawn structures. One of the previous episodes, actually, of this educational speedrun series focused on a couple of games that had this d4 versus d5 pawn structure, and we talked a lot about how these knights on c6 and c3, blocking the c2 or the c7 pawn, can be pretty harmful for the position. Black is not able to protect their d5 pawn. They're not able to attack our pawn on d4 as easily because the c pawn's blocked. So we're pretty much going for a knight f3, g3, bishop g2 approach, but with the kind of added fact that we have the pawn on d4 already. And for the most part, we're going to kind of turn the position into a bit of a Catalan-esque type of situation. We're going to play the move c4 in the near future. But again, the downside for black of this particular configuration of things is that the knight on c6 is kind of misplaced. Now, the bishop on b4 is also kind of oddly placed here, I will say. I could simply play a move like a3 or c3 just to kick it backwards. I think I'll just start off with a3. I don't really see why not. I could also just leave it there, still play the move c4, or now play b3 followed by c4. I might actually go for b3 first. Usually you can get away with the move c4 right away, and then if black takes the pawn, then you can play queen a4 to pin the knight and attack the pawn, but it kind of ends up that the bishop on b4 would kind of block our queen off from attacking the c4 pawn. So I think given the circumstance, we're just going to prepare the move c4 with the b3 move, then we're going to play c4 afterwards here. And then, if black isn't careful, we're actually already threatening to play the move pawn to c5, which would then trap the bishop pretty quickly on the queen side here. So that might actually still be possible depending on what black does after they've exchanged this pair of pawns. c5 and then a3 is maybe an idea, but we don't have the b4 pawn to attack the bishop if it goes to the a5 square, so we're a little bit less in a rush to play c5 now. But it's still a pretty good looking position for us because we simply have more space than our opponent in the middle of the board. So the knight goes into the e4 square. Maybe black wants to play knight c3 or something like that. I'm going to play the move queen to c2 just to attack that knight. If black tries to take the pawn on d4, we'll just take the knight on e4, so that's perfectly fine for us. I assume they're going to play a move like f5 protecting the knight. That would be kind of my assumption at this point. If they move the knight backwards, though, then the bishop on b4 might start, it could start running kind of low on squares. Black would have to be a bit careful about that. Moving the knight back to f6 doesn't really, I was going to say, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. He just went to e4, went back to f6. You can kind of consider it like we played queen to c2, and we're getting to play another move for free. And it kind of feels like black just wasted 2 full moves at this point. So they are threatening to take on d4, though. I have to be a little bit careful about that. I will play rook to d1 to defend that. And then next I'll play moves like e4, maybe bishop g5 to make the pin. Maybe still play knight c3 in the near future. Maybe kick the bishop with a3. I'm not really in a rush to attack this bishop because it's not really doing a whole lot on the b4 square. And it's not like attacking it is going to make it run into trouble. It's most likely just going to go back to e7, which would be a pretty safe square. Now here black goes for this move b6, which does have a big downside to it. Now the knight on c6 is undefended. The rook on a8 is also on this lineup with our bishop. And I think we can just go ahead and play a move like knight to e5, going after the piece that's pinned. And I think that black is just going to lose material here. If he takes the knight, we can even take back with the pawn, open up the attack on the queen, continue attacking the rook. Black is in pretty bad shape there. We'd also still be attacking the knight on f6, which is also good. And if black tries to take the pawn on d4, we might even be able to just move the queen over to the d3 square, attack the knight, and then the knight on d4 would be hit, the rook on a8 would be hit, it would be hard for black to defend everything. So he decides to take on e5. I could take the rook, and that would just land me ahead material, but taking the knight, I believe, is even stronger, because there's just way too many things that are being attacked. We're attacking the queen, the knight, the rook. We're equal on material, but black can't defend all three things simultaneously. So he decides to save the knight. The problem there is, though, that the rook is worth 5 points, so now I'm ahead 5 points in material, and black is in very bad shape because of that. So you always have to be careful from black's perspective about weakening this diagonal that our bishop is on. Here I'm going to play bishop c6 to attack the knight that's pinned. And then I think I can even play queen to d3 to continue piling up on this knight. I guess there is queen e7, and if I take the knight, they make a pin. So maybe queen a4 is actually a better version. Queen a4, we attack the bishop, we attack the knight. Yeah, here black is losing additional material. We also keep the rook defended, so even if black tries to pin us on the d-file somehow, it doesn't really work out for them. Just way too many things are being attacked, and they're already down one rook, and they're going to lose even more material here. So let's take the knight. I can take with the queen or the rook. I guess I'll take with the queen, offer the trade. We have to speed up on time here a little bit, but we are up a full rook and a knight. So we'll just develop, attack stuff, offer trades. Let's put the knight in the center of the board. Probably he'll move the queen to try to attack the knight. I'm just going to play a move like f3 to protect it. If he wants to check, I can just take the bishop on the c5 square. Otherwise, I'll try to trade off this bishop and see what we can do about that. Let's go queen to c6, I guess, just to guard the pawn. And then develop the bishop somewhere. We might even have ideas of like sacrificing the knight to get a big attack on the king, but mostly here I'm not going to focus on that kind of unnecessary stuff. I'm mostly going to focus on just trying to trade pieces and also try and activate the rest of my pieces. Queen here is just a free queen. I don't know if he meant to go to a different square, but yeah, here I'm going to just double up the rooks and then put the rook on the back rank. We'll do that. Rook here we can pretty much pre-move. I don't really care if this pawn is captured, quite honestly. Take that. We'll take this to guard the pawn and then attack the f7 pawn. Let's take this. We're also now threatening knight f6 checkmate because the pawn's pinned. Move the king. And this checkmate is... Oh, okay, he stopped that. Okay, next move we will take on g7. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, we'll just take the pawn. And then move the queen over one more square. We do deliver the checkmate, and we get the win here. Alright, so that's it for this one. I think the biggest mistake that black made in this game, we'll still look at the game review though in a bit, but I think the biggest mistake that black made in this particular game, first of all, bishop to b4 was a little bit odd. That being said, I don't think it was like a big blunder necessarily. Probably the biggest mistake was this kind of waste of time for the knight going to e4 and then going back to f6, because as the game progressed, we were able to just get a nice space advantage, and even if black hadn't made the b6 mistake, we would play moves like e4 and e5 and just kind of roll down the center of the board. But yeah, we'll move over to the game review and check it out there in just a moment. All right, looks like we played at a 96.7% accuracy to our opponent's 80.9. We had one miss, probably somewhere in the end game where we could have won the game a little bit quicker, but okay, let's take a look at the analysis. So knight f3, knight c6. I do play the move d4 or recommend this move in this particular position. We don't want to play something like, let's say, g3 going for kind of a ready fianchetto and allow black to play the move e5. This is a little bit better for black already because they get the move e5 in for free. We don't want to go b3 and again allow black to play e5 once again. Black is already a little bit better here as well. And even if you go for c4, kind of going for a more pure ready approach, once again, black can play the move e5 and white's still a tiny bit better, but we'd really rather we'd really like to prevent black from playing the move e5 on move number 2. or pretty much at any point in this kind of opening repertoire that I recommend. So d4 prevents e5. We get into a d4, d5 pawn structure with black having the knight misplaced on c6. We go g3, bishop to g2. And the bishop going to b4 was a little bit odd. Usually the bishop will go to the e7 square. And then here we can either go for c4 right away, or we can prepare it like I did in the game. You can go for b3 first, and then c4. And white is a little bit better off here because of the extra space. And the fact that black's bishop on c8 is not that great of a piece at this point. So instead, though, they went bishop to b4. A little bit odd. And after b3, we go c4. We do get the space advantage. Knight e4 was really just a wasted move. I think if black wants to play this position, they probably should play a move like queen e7 and maybe try to play e5, or maybe rook e8 and try to play e5. Usually if you're behind on space, you don't want to be letting the opponent own that space advantage without at least a little bit of a fight. So black really needs to try to push for this e5 pawn break. The other pawn break they could try to go for to attack our d4 pawn would be to push with c5. But again, because they placed their knight on c6 on the very, on the second move of the game, that type of pawn break's a bit harder for them to pull off, which means that our center is a little more secure than it normally would be able to be if the knight wasn't blocking the c-pawn. Knight e4, though, kind of just ended up wasting them time. I thought they were going to play f5 to at least keep the knight held in place. I was probably going to play the move rook to d1, and then develop, maybe push the pawn to d5 to attack the knight. White's a bit better off here, but at least compared to the game, I didn't get two moves in for free. Because in the game, after knight f6, rook d1, you can kind of imagine that we just, we have this position here. This was move number 8 of the game. And then now all of a sudden we have this position here, and black hasn't done anything. It's almost like black just gave us the move queen c2 and rook to d1 for free, which is really a bad sign for them. Giving your opponent a couple of moves for free is not really a great thing. And then b6 was a kind of tactical mistake. We went for knight e5, taking advantage of this pin. The bishop on g2 always makes it difficult for the opponent to develop the queen side, because it really just locks down a lot of important squares on that side of the board. If black had taken on d4, which is probably his best bet, I think I was going to play queen to d3, and there's really just not a great way to protect the rook and the knight. We're going to take one of these two next move, and then we're just going to be ahead material, which is nice for us. So instead, black decided to take the knight. You could take the rook right away. I decided to take the knight first, and again, there's just way too many things being attacked, and black ended up losing the rook, and then we are in good shape. We are ahead a lot of material, eventually won the game. Black blundered their queen, but yeah, we eventually got the checkmate and got the win. Apparently rook to c7 is, I guess I missed checkmate in 1, but okay, rook to d7 does still deliver checkmate pretty soon. So anyways, though, that's the first game. Let's go ahead and get into our second one here. All right, we've got game number 2 here, playing against AlphaZero. AlphaZero, okay, so that's what they're getting at, AlphaZero. So after knight f3, they decide to go for the move c6. Against c6, so I think here I'm just going to go for the move g3. If I go for e4 or d4, if I go for e4, they could play d5, and then we're kind of actually turning the position into a caro-kann, which is totally fine. If we go for c4, I guess they can play d5, and maybe it turns into a Slav defense. I'm going to go for the move g3. I think c4 would also be fine. b3 even would be fine. All of those moves are playable. I'm just going to go for the fianchetto approach. Let's castle the king. So we've got our kind of king side setup going on here. What I'm going to do now is play the move c4 to strike at the center. Usually when you're playing against this kind of almost like London system-esque setup that your opponent, they're going for in black shoes, it's usually best to not actually put the pawn on d4 very early in the game, because you usually want the pawn to be able to go to the d3 square in order to restrict the knight on f6 and the bishop on f5. So I don't want to rush to make the move d4 here. The bishop would just get a nice diagonal. If I go for c4, though, and then they played knight f6 as they did in the game, here I can actually start to take a little bit of advantage of the fact that the bishop is not on the c8 square anymore. And I can play this move queen to b3, attacking the pawn on b7. Now, black ends up playing the move queen to c7 to defend it. Now I can go for the move, let's say, d3 here. restricting the bishop and the knight. And my idea or plan is to play bishop f4 potentially to attack the queen. Now, black does play bishop d6 to kind of stop that idea. The drawback to this organization of pieces, though, I will say, first of all, if I can ever get a knight to the b5 square under a good circumstance, it's going to fork the queen and the bishop. Of course, I would have to do something about the c6 pawn first. The other problem with this particular setup for black is that if I ever get to play e4, they're also going to have to worry about the pawn coming up to e5 and maybe making a fork. So to work in that direction, I'm going to start with the move knight to c3. This eyes the b5 square and also sets up some e4 ideas. And now I'm going to play the move pawn to e4, I think. Or, sorry, I'm going to play the move rook to e1, preparing the move pawn to e4. And now the threat is to play e4, and then play e5 afterwards. Now, black plays the move knight to d7. They are preventing us from playing this idea, because now there is more coverage on the e5 square. Sorry. So what I'm going to do is... I'm still going to play for e4, but I think I'm going to take the pawn on d5 first. Let's do that to begin with. Black will most likely take with their e-pawn. Now I'm going to go for the move e4. If they play knight c5 to attack my queen and pawns, I'll just bring the queen back to c2. That's not a big deal. Queen to c2 will keep the queen safe and stuff like that. And now I'm going to try to, let's say, I want to get the bishop off the c1 square so I can play rook c1 and then hint at this knight b5 idea. They can't play e5, they've got that covered. I would like to play, let's say, like bishop e3, but then I would end up losing the pawn on e4. So I'm actually going to start with the move knight to h4. Let's harass the bishop on the g6 square. This also opens up my bishop to defend the pawn. And let's say, for example, now I can eliminate the bishop. They're going to take back with the h-pawn, which is mandatory since the f-pawn's pinned. And then I can develop my bishop. I don't know if I want to go to e3 or to g5. I might go to g5 first, just to poke the knight a little bit. The idea, though, is still to play rook c1 and line up towards the queen. And that's going to essentially force black to move their queen another time or move their bishop another time. And that's going to cost them time. That's kind of the idea. So I might put the rook on c1. He plays rook e6, which is kind of odd. I can now play bishop h3, for example, if I really want to harass the rook. But I think I still want to go for rook to c1. I think so, yeah. So let's go rook c1, still hinting at the knight b5 idea. But bishop h3 very well may come in handy pretty soon. He does not end up stopping me from playing the move knight to b5, and so I am going to go for that idea. Fork the queen and the bishop, take advantage of the pin. Probably they'll go to b6, is my guess. I'm also attacking the a-pawn, so they have to be a little bit careful about that. If they go to b6, I'll take the bishop on d6. If they go to a5, that's fine with me. I will still take the bishop on d6. I am also attacking the rook on e8, so even if they try to take my bishop on okay, well, if they try to take my bishop on g5, I was also attacking the rook simultaneously. So now I can just simply take the rook. They definitely should have just taken back on d6. That was a big mistake from them. I also can even take the pawn on b7 pretty soon, which is what I think I'm going to go for. So we might as well just grab an additional pawn. a7's hit, c6 is hit. I don't really mind too much if he gets the rook down to the b2 square because I'm going to pick up enough pawns. I'm going to pick up enough pawns in the process that it doesn't make a huge difference there. So, yeah, this looks quite bad for black. They're down a pawn, they're down the exchange. He does guard the c6 pawn, but I guess I can still take that pawn anyways. I might as well do that, since I'm also trying to trade pieces. So let's take there and offer a trade. And now that I'm ahead material, the more things I can get off the board and trade, the better. We're just trying to play with our material advantage at this point. Maybe bishop h3 was also possible to line up towards the rook and the knight, but lots of ways are good to play here. We just need to keep it simple. No need to do anything super fancy. We have a pretty large advantage regardless of what we do. Alright, I'm going to check on, I guess, the c8 square. I can play f4 next move to attack the queen and the knight. I'm also down a ton of time, so I need to play... I need to speed up here, but... Yeah, I think we're just taking the knight next move. Here I do need to trade the queens first. And then I'll take this knight. Put the rook down here on the 7th rank just to go attack pawns. If I get rid of the a pawn, then I can push my pawn. Let's go there and attack it. I could also take the f7 pawn, of course, but I'm more focused on getting my a pawn. Let's go here, attack this pawn. I guess we can just take it, I suppose. Let's attack the rook, or attack the knight, sorry. And now we'll just push the pawn. Nothing black can really do about that. We can pin the knight and eliminate the knight. Here I think we have probably some kind of checkmate around the corner. Ooh, man, I need to be careful that I don't stalemate black. Let's not do that. Pretty close to stalemating him there. Okay. Alright. That was a pretty close one. He put the pawns on the g6 and g5 squares. Actually was pretty close to for me to stalemate him if I wasn't a bit more careful there. Yeah, so we end up getting the win. I think the big mistake that he made in this game, as we'll look at in the game review in a moment, opening-wise, black was totally fine. All of this was generally fine for black. I think the mistake that he ran into ultimately was probably this rookie. I don't know, maybe rook e6, calling this a bit of a mistake is too much. I would say the biggest one is allowing me to make the fork on b5, and then for sure it's queen takes g5. I mean, that's definitely the biggest mistake that he made. It ends up losing him the exchange. He definitely should just take back on d6. I would have moved the bishop to f4, for example, and we would be a bit better off because we have the pair of bishops and a little more space, but the game would continue on. It's not like I am having some gigantic, overwhelming advantage. I would be very happy with my position, but the game would still go on and it would be a bit complicated. That being said, though, let's move over to the game review and we'll check out the game there. All right, we're on the game review side of things. Let's check it out. So knight f3, c6. Here there's a number of different ways you could play. c6 is not really it's not a bad move. It's a little awkward, I will say. Usually if you're going to play c6 then d5, you might as well play d5 on move number 1 right away, but c6 doesn't really change a whole lot. It is preparing the move d5, it's flexible. I guess you could play this if you're kind of hoping that white plays a move like e4, and then black gets to transpose into a caro-kann position, which could definitely occur if you played e4, c6, knight f3, then d5. But yeah, usually playing c6 on move 1's not the most popular, but it is a solid and perfectly fine move. So because of this, I don't want to play e4 or d4 right away necessarily, because black, if I go for e4, they're going to play the caro-kann as we just saw. And if I go d4, they play d5, and we kind of just play a sort of Slavish position, where I've already committed the pawn to d4. So if I, for example, went for the same setup as in the game, you know, still the knight f3, g3, bishop g2. As I mentioned during the game, the pawn on d4 against the bishop on f5 is not the most precise way of setting things up, because now the bishop has a more open diagonal, and the knight's also got the ability to jump into e4. Whereas in the game, our pawn on d3 restricted that. We had the plan of playing e4, and that worked out nicely for us, as we saw. So, interesting, some little nuances in the opening phase. I just decided to stick with g3, and then bishop g2. We do get this set up after c4. First of all, if black does take the pawn on c4, sometimes you'll be able to get it back, sometimes it will turn into a gambit. If the bishop's already on the f5 square, it's more likely to be a gambit at this point, and we can do something like b3, pawn takes, queen takes. We play d3, e4, develop the bishop. Black is up a pawn, of course, but white is going to be able to get the space advantage in the center of the board with the d3 and e4 pretty soon, and the lead in development's also pretty nice. So the computer says it's pretty equal, but I always like having these positions with a little bit of a lead in development and some pressure on the opponent. Instead of capturing, though, they went for knight f6. Now we go for queen to b3. And this is one of the slight drawbacks to the bishop developing to the f5 square early in the game, is that the pawn on b7 is unprotected. Now, our opponent went for queen c7 to defend it. Queen to b6 is a more common move. I've played against this variation in this position tons of times in my own games. I would still continue with d3. Maybe we bring the bishop to e3 to harass the queen, and we really don't mind too much if black decides to trade the queens. Because if the queens get traded, we actually get this open file, or half-open file for the rook, and white is doing perfectly fine in these kind of positions. Sometimes you can even use the b pawn as a bit of a battering ram to run up to the b5 square and to create some trouble on the queen side. Instead of that, though, our opponent went queen c7. We still go for d3. Once again, I don't want to play d4. It just gives the bishop more space. So I went for d3. Part of the plan was to play bishop f4. For example, if they played bishop e7, then I would probably have gone for bishop f4. But they stopped my idea. I developed the knight. I looked to prepare the e4 push. And eventually we do get the push. We do get the knight on h4, harassing the bishop. I didn't really want to play bishop e3 here and just lose the pawn in the center. That would be pretty bad. So I played knight h4 to attack the bishop. Even if he tries to save the bishop by moving it to the f5 square, now he opens up, or the h5 square, sorry. Now he opens up the f5 square, and this actually becomes quite annoying for black because if they avoid the capture, we hit the queen moves, we can now protect our f2 pawn. Our pieces are looking really good, and now moves like knight to a4 are pretty big threats at this point. Knight a4 would be a very annoying move for black to face. So they played rook e8 instead. I took the bishop. Probably don't have to necessarily rush for the capture, but I decided to grab it, develop my bishop, and apparently going to g5 is maybe not the best location. Maybe in hindsight I should be dropping the queen back to the c2 square to keep the pawn protected, and then maybe I can go bishop e3 afterwards or something like that. So I guess if black plays correctly here, they're going to be a little bit better off because of my bishop being on the less ideal square. But black kind of makes an accuracy of their own pretty quickly. We line up towards the queen, we do make the fork, we pick up the bishop, and yeah, black should definitely take the knight on d6. I would move back and hit the rook. If the rook moves away, for instance, maybe now I can consider capturing the pawn on b7. If black does something else like knight to e5, probably I would play something like rook to d1. And it's a little bit of an advantage for white, nothing super major at this point, but we are a little bit better off primarily because we have the space advantage and the pair of bishops. But the game would go on and black is not that much worse off here. In the game, though, they ended up losing material. And once they lost the material, their position collapsed pretty quickly. We won more material, traded queens, won another knight, and then eventually just pushed the a-pawn down the board, made a queen. And I had to be very careful about stalemate here. I almost pushed the pawn right away, which would have actually been stalemate because the king would have no moves available. I played king g1 to free up some squares for the opponent, kept my rook safe, and once again, I almost played a move like queen to d3, which would have been stalemate. And then even here, I have to make sure that I move the queen to give up the g3 square. Eventually got the checkmate. So very easy to make mistakes, especially in time trouble here. When your opponent, even if you're completely winning the game, you're up a ton of pieces, you still have to be careful for stalemate and little tricks from the opponent that they might try to throw at you. So we were able to dodge a few bullets here, but we got the job done. We got the win. That's it for the second game. Let's get into our third one. All right, we've got game number 3 here. Our opponent's playing d3, which is not a very common move. I think against openings where my opponent is not fighting for control over the center, I think I'm just going to put my pawns in the center of the board. I think that's a pretty good just recipe for success. He does play knight f3, which prevents me from playing pawn to e5. I'm going to go for c5, knight c6, and then e5. That's the game plan, just to take as much space as I can. He plays the move e4. Now, it is possible here to trade the pawns and trade the queens, but I actually don't know if I want to go for that because I would lose out on my space advantage. And forcing the trade of queens and having the opponent's king stuck in the center of the board is really not that bad for them when I don't really have a lead in development to take advantage of it with. Without the queens on the board, the king being stuck in the center is not too much of a problem because it's harder to attack the king. So here I'm going to go for knight f6. And I'm just going to protect my pawn. I will take back with my knight, develop my knight, and still try to play e5. That's still kind of the idea I'm going for. probably it's best for white to throw in the move d4. But if they don't do that, I'm just grabbing that space in the center. I don't have the pawn on d5 anymore. It is replaced with the knight. But nonetheless, I do have a nice space advantage. I have 2 pawns on the 5th rank, 0 pawns for my opponent on the 4th rank. Now, usually in these kind of situations, you want to avoid trading pieces. So for that reason, I'm actually going to drop the knight backwards. Avoid this capture. I could have captured and doubled white's pawns, but I think I'd rather keep pieces on the board with my space advantage. And the game plan here is now just to develop, and prevent the opponent from attacking my center too easily. That's kind of my game plan. So bishop e7, castle, bishop e6. They go for the move b4, which does attack my center, but it's not a safe move. I think I'm able to just capture 2 times. I don't want to use my knight because then I would lose the pawn in the center. I need to keep that protected, but I can take with the bishop. And simply put, I think white's just lost a pawn. Now, the move b4 from them, if they had prepared it a bit better and it had been safe to pull off without me winning the pawn, then I do think it's a good idea for white to go for that. b4 is a good way of attacking one of my 2 central pawns that are giving me a space advantage. But when it's not safe to go for and not prepared well enough, then it works out better for us. So here I'm just simply ahead of pawn. Gonna develop my pieces, keep my pawn on e5 safe, untangle my kind of queenside pieces, get my knight on c7 to a better square, and really just look to make use of my my lead-in material. I was about to say lead-in development, but that's not really the case here. So they go for knight to e4. They are attacking my pawn on e5, so I need to watch out for that. I think I'll just play rook e8. Let's protect the pawn. Also, I'm making it harder for white to play a move like d4, which would attack my center, because then I can take the pawn and attack the knight. So when you have a space advantage, one of your first goals is usually to reinforce or maintain or kind of make your space-gaining pawns kind of impenetrable. In the case of the pawns we had on e5 and c5, white tried to attack the c5 pawn with the b4 move, but it didn't work out well because it lost the material. And here, they could try to play a move like d4 at the right time, which would be another pawn break to attack my center, but I'm making it harder for them to pull off at this point because then the knight would be unprotected. So they go knight to d2. Now, in terms of exchanging pieces or trading stuff when you are ahead material, you don't want to just make the first exchange you see and just jump for every exchange possible. For instance, I could consider taking the knight on d2 with my bishop to trade pieces, but there's really no need to take this knight on d2 that's not really doing much and trade off one of my bishops. I'd rather, if I'm going to trade a bishop, I'm going to trade it for another bishop rather than trading it for a knight. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and make the move f5. This is another advantage to having more space than your opponent, is you have more space, you can start to push your pawns further up the board and gain a bigger space advantage, be a bit greedy. And so, yeah, I'm going to make that be the case here. Here I'm going to drop the bishop back. I think I'll go back to the c5 square. Actually, I want to go bishop to c5. I could also play pawn to e4, trying to take advantage of this pin. But I don't know if I'm really in a rush to do that just yet. Let me put it that way. So let's go. I think he wants to play knight c4 and put pressure on my pawn. That's kind of what I assume he's going to do. How do we want to handle this? I think I will just go bishop e6. If he goes knight c4, I may actually make this particular trade because it would also double white's pawns at the same time. He'd have to take back with the d3 pawn. In that version of things, I'm a little more happy to trade off a bishop because I'm getting more of an advantage along with it. Okay, here he's hitting my rook. I'm just going to play g6 to block that off. He's probably going to bring the bishop back to f3. If he goes bishop to f3, then I very well may play the move pawn to e4, taking advantage of the pawn on d3 being pinned. Also, the bishop on f3 would be threatening to take my knight and then my pawn, so I'd have to watch out for that. But yeah, for the most part, I think we're just going to kick the bishop backwards and see where it goes. Probably should go back to the e2 square. King h1, that's a bit of a crazy move. Okay, I guess I will take the piece for free. Don't really see why not. He's also leaving the knight on d2 undefended. I think we can just continue grabbing material. And he's only attacking us with the queen and the knight. And that's not really enough material to attack us with. For instance, I can now play the move queen to g5, simply offering a trade of queens, and if he doesn't trade the queens, I'm also attacking the knight on f5 at the same time. So, okay, sure, my king is a little bit exposed, but not near enough for him to checkmate me. Also here, my queen and bishop are both attacking the knight that's giving me a check. I can just take that. And I think he might have forgotten that I have the bishop on the d2 square. So now I'm just ahead 3 pieces. The attack completely disappeared instantly, and now we just win with our, with our extra material. He's giving up another pawn, giving up another piece. I think he's just done at this point. Yeah, unfortunately for him, that attack kind of fizzled out very, very quickly. So yeah, that is going to most likely be the game. I don't know if he's going to let the time run out. If he does, I'll just cut I'll cut the recording here and jump into the game review, but we'll see what happens. All right, he did end up abandoning the game, but yeah, we were definitely winning at that point anyways. We'll just go ahead and jump right over to the game review and take a look at this one. All right, on the game review side of things here, we began the game after d3 with the move d5. And for the most part, my general MO when I'm playing against a player who's allowing me to grab the space in the center of the board, whether we're playing white, whether we're playing black, if they allow us to just put the pawns on d5, e5, c5 as black, then that's what I'm going to go for. So in the game, white played the move e4, knight f6. I could have traded the pawns here. I wasn't really... I don't know, I'm not super crazy about this particular position. The computer also says white's even a little bit better here, despite their king having moved. And the main issue here is that even though white has moved their king, they can always play the moves c3 and king c2. The king is pretty safe on that square. And it's actually not that easy to break through white's position. There's not much of an advantage that we have. In terms of space, we're actually equal at this point. Whereas just a moment ago, we were actually, ahead on space. So I'm not actually in a rush to make this particular trade. I decided to go knight f6 instead. What white probably should have gone for in hindsight, rather than taking the pawn, is they should push to e5. I moved the knight. And then they can play c3 followed by d4, and we would pretty much get into an interesting version of the French defense. Let's say something like this happens. It's a solid position for both sides. It's not the general version of the French defense I tend to play if I am playing the French defense. I do have a whole entire French defense speedrun series here on YouTube as well. In that particular version of the French defense, I would play something different. I'll just point out real quick how you could get that position we just saw on the board through the French defense. e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, or at least a version of it. Let's say knight f6, e5, knight f3, I guess even knight to e2. Let's see. I guess it would be a little bit different, but essentially something like this would be at least a very similar pawn structure, right? This version, the knight was on b1, whereas what I just played through a second ago was on e2, but it's a very similar pawn structure. If I'm playing the French defense myself, in the other speedrun videos that you can check out, the other speedrun series, I would actually go for the capture on e4, followed by bishop d7 to c6, which gets us into a Fort Knox variation, which is a very solid way of playing as well for black. Anyways, though, in this game, white decided to trade the pawns on d5. Then we played knight c6. Probably they should play the move d4 to prevent us from playing e5. But once we're able to play e5, we're a little bit better off here because of that space advantage once again. I decided to avoid the trade of knights. Apparently other moves were good too, but generally speaking, when you're ahead on space, you want to keep pieces on the board because the player who's behind on space has those pieces stepping on each other's toes a bit more. So I decided to avoid the trade, develop the bishop. He made the first kind of real mistake in the game, which was allowing me to win the pawn on b4 for free. But if he could prepare the move b4 better, let's imagine he got to play it, right? Let's say he played rook b1, maybe I castle. Let's say, this is probably not the best way of preparing it, but let's say something like, I don't know, knight e4, let's say I just played f6 as an example, and let's say something like this occurred. He plays bishop d2, he plays b4, and he prepares the move, and here it is safe for him to play. Here I would probably end up having to weaken or my position or lose my space advantage. The computer recommends one of the moves being b6, but after white takes the pawn and we take back, we do still have the space advantage, but now we also have a couple of isolated pawns at the same time. So there's at least some advantages to white, whereas in the game they were behind on space with nothing really to work for. If I don't play b6 and I take the pawn instead, black is still a little bit better off here as well, but I don't have as much of a space advantage. Now it's a 1 versus 1 situation if we look at the 4th and 5th ranks, rather than a 2 versus 0 that we have in the game, pretty much. So I do think that the move b4 is something that white should be working towards. b4, d4, and f4 are the 3 main pawn breaks that white can try to play to chip away at our space advantage. d4 is not happening anytime soon. We've got that covered really well. f4 is hard to do with the knight being on f3. b4 is the most likely one that they can work towards, but they need to prepare it first. In the game, they didn't really prepare it adequately, and this just allowed us to win the pawn for free. So now we're just up a pawn. I defend with rook to e8, which ends up being the best move. If I played the move f6, I was a little bit worried about white maybe playing the move d4 and challenging my pawn in the center of the board. With rook to e8, white can no longer play d4 because after we take, we're attacking the knight. So they can't do that. Here I kick the knight, developed, and then here he kind of went a bit crazy and just allowed me to win the bishop, win the knight, trade the queens. If he doesn't trade the queens, I'm going to win the knight on f5. In the game, I won the knight anyways. And yeah, he kind of just, I think he just decided to give up. He's down way too much material, and the attack disappeared very, very quickly. So I will say a lot of players in this position, I think, would be very scared to take the bishop. They would say like, oh, if I take the bishop, the queen comes in, the knight's over there, I'm going to get mated, it looks dangerous. But it's very important to recognize in this kind of position that even if we didn't have the capture on d2, let's say I couldn't capture the knight on d2 for whatever reason, it's not like the queen and the knight are about to checkmate us and there's no way we could deal with it. I could even just play a move like, I don't know, queen to d7 and then swing the queen over for defense, and it's pretty unlikely that the attack is going to work. White could, of course, continue trying, and he very well should keep trying to attack, but it doesn't mean that the attack is guaranteed to work here. And I think I have enough defenders around the king, and with the extra piece that I have, if the attack doesn't work out for white, they just lose the game. They just lose because they're down a piece. So in the game, though, it ends up being that I can also take the knight, which is even better. And then if, when you're ahead material and you're being attacked, trading queens is a great idea. That ends up happening in the game, and yeah, we just win the game after we're ahead way too much material. So that's going to do it for our 3rd game in this episode. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. If you want to see more episodes of this Speedrun series, there is going to be the playlist to the left of the video here. That's going to do it for me, though. I'll see you in the next episode. See you then.